Labor Day weekend 2006, Lima, Ohio, a quiet suburb where neighbors wave from driveways and children ride bikes until dusk. At 5:18 in the morning, while the rest of the neighborhood slept, a man picked up a phone and dialed 911. He said his carbon monoxide detector was screaming. He said his wife was having a seizure. He said he was trying to save her. But when the paramedics arrived just 4 minutes later, Kathy Wengler wasn't seizing. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't even warm. She had been dead for hours. And the man who called for help, he was her husband, a doctor, a man who had spent his entire career mastering the science of gases, knowing exactly how much was too much. This is the story of a house full of secrets and a wife who never made it out alive. To understand what happened in that house on Yorkshire Drive, you first need to understand Kathy. Kathy Wengler was not a woman who asked for much. She was a mother, a wife, a woman who laughed easily and loved her children fiercely. On the surface, the Wenglers appeared to be the picture of American success. Mark was a prominent anesthesiologist in Lima, Ohio, respected, credentialed, well-paid. Kathy raised their 2 sons, Aaron and Nathan, and kept the family together in a comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood. But behind closed doors, something had curdled. Somewhere along the way, Mark had begun to see his wife not as a partner, but as a problem. He was reportedly furious about what he called her failures, her housekeeping, her weight, her spending. He called her a monster to her own mother because she didn't follow his instructions. Kathy, for her part, carried burdens she kept hidden. Investigators would later discover she had accumulated around $60,000 in credit card debt and a secret bank account holding $16,000, money she may have been quietly setting aside. For what? An escape? A future? A life without him? We'll never know. What we do know is this. By the summer of 2006, Mark and Kathy were sleeping in separate bedrooms. Their marriage was described by those close to it as having hit rock bottom. And Mark Wengler, anesthesiologist, husband, father, was running out of patience. It was Labor Day weekend, September 3rd, rolling into the 4th, 2006. The neighborhood was quiet. Most people were sleeping in. Inside the Wengler home, something else was happening. Mark later told investigators he had been sleeping on the first floor, in the master bedroom. He explained that a toilet had overflowed earlier that night, and he'd set up a fan near an open window to help dry the wet floor. Convenient. Very convenient. Kathy was upstairs, as she had been for some time now, sleeping on an air mattress in the second-floor bedroom, alone. At precisely 5:18 a.m., Mark dialed 911. He reported the carbon monoxide detector was going off. He said Kathy was seizing. He said he was doing CPR. He said he was opening windows. Fire Chief Joseph Kitchen arrived in 4 minutes, 5:22 a.m. He found Kathy on the floor of the upstairs bedroom, partially on the air mattress, partially on the carpet. She was unresponsive. The paramedics checked her vitals. Flatline. She was rushed to Lima Memorial Hospital, where she was pronounced dead at 5:54 a.m., 38 minutes after the 911 call. Mark was also taken to the hospital, treated for carbon monoxide exposure. His carboxyhemoglobin level, the measure of CO in the blood, was 13%. High enough to feel sick. Survivable. Kathy's? Nearly 70%. Enough to kill. The gap between those two numbers would become the first crack in Mark Wengler's story. Read that again. 1 to 2 hours. If true, and the medical evidence strongly suggested it was, then Mark didn't call 911 because he heard an alarm and found his wife seizing. He waited, and then he called. But there was still the question of the carbon monoxide itself. Where had it come from? Investigators brought in the gas company and forensic engineer Steve Erlenbach to test every appliance in the house: the furnace, the water heater, the vent-free fireplace. All of them were functioning properly. None were emitting dangerous levels of carbon monoxide. So where did nearly 70% saturation come from? The answer, when it finally came, would be both ingenious and monstrous. The Allen County Sheriff's Department assigned Detective Clyde Brightigan to the case. At first, it looked like a tragic accident: a faulty appliance, a sleeping family, a terrible outcome. It happened. CO poisoning was known to kill in the night. But Brightigan was thorough, and the more he learned about the Wanglers, the more the picture shifted. He learned about the separate bedrooms, the deteriorating marriage, Mark's documented contempt for his wife. He learned that Mark, of all the people in that house, had been sleeping in a room with an open window and a running fan, in a home that supposedly flooded with lethal carbon monoxide. His exposure was just 13%. Kathy's was 70. How does a gas that fills a house kill one person, the one on the second floor with no window open, and barely touch the man sleeping on the ground floor? Unless the gas didn't fill the house at all. Unless it was directed. Brightigan began to ask a new question. What if the carbon monoxide hadn't come from the house's own appliances at all? What if it had been introduced from the outside, pumped in deliberately? And if so, who in that house had the scientific knowledge to understand exactly how to do it? The answer was standing right in front of them. A man who spent his professional life calculating gas dosages. A man who knew, better than almost anyone, how much CO it took to kill and how long it would take. Mark Wangler's defense team had answers for everything. The soot marks above the air register? Candles. The family burned candles regularly, they said. Aaron and Nathan, Mark's sons, took the stand and backed up their father. The soot was from candles. Nothing sinister. The malfunctioning appliances theory? The defense pointed to a water heater vent, arguing it could have malfunctioned and introduced CO into the home without showing signs of damage during later testing. And Mark himself? They painted him as a loving father wrongly accused, a grieving widower railroaded by investigators who had made up their minds too early, a man of deep faith being crucified for the crime of being a complicated husband. They even challenged the search of his journals, arguing the investigators had gone beyond what the warrant allowed, and they weren't entirely wrong. The Ohio 3rd District Court of Appeals would later agree that the journal seizure had exceeded the scope of the warrant. For a moment, it looked like it might unravel. But the court went on to call it a harmless error. The other evidence, they said, was more than enough. Because while the defense was pointing at candles and technicalities, the prosecution scientists were doing something the defense couldn't explain away. They were reading the soot itself. The question wasn't just whether carbon monoxide was present. The question was where it came from. And that's where Dr. Jamie Schauer entered the picture. Working at the Wisconsin State Laboratory of Hygiene, Dr. Schauer applied a technique that most people had never heard of: molecular tracer analysis. This method involves examining the chemical fingerprint of combustion byproducts, the microscopic signature left behind by different sources of burning. Every source of combustion leaves a distinct chemical footprint: a residential gas furnace, a candle, a wood fire, a car engine. They are not the same. When Dr. Schauer analyzed the soot collected from the ductwork in the Wangler home, specifically the soot above the second floor air register, he found molecular tracers consistent with one source and one source only: internal combustion engine exhaust. Not a furnace, not a candle, not a water heater, a motor vehicle, or something like one. Investigators looked again at what Mark Wangler owned: a car and an RV, a recreational vehicle parked in or near the property. The theory that Detective Brightigan had been building suddenly had a spine. Mark Wangler, physician, anesthesiologist, expert in the lethal and the precise, had, investigators concluded, used a mobile combustion source to pump exhaust through the home's ductwork system, directly into the room where his wife slept. He had used his professional knowledge as a murder weapon. And the soot on the wall above that air register was his fingerprint. The forensic science was damning, but it was the words in Mark Wangler's own handwriting that sealed his fate. When investigators seized his personal journals, they found something that no amount of attorney spin could neutralize. Mark wrote about his marriage as a spiritual battle. He wrote that Satan, his word, had found a weak area to attack him through his marriage and his family. He described feeling trapped, with no escape. He wrote that he prayed for God to act in a powerful way, days before Kathy died. But the entry that stopped investigators cold, the one that made hardened detectives pause, was a passage in which Mark wrote about suicidal ideation. He described thoughts of ending his own life using car exhaust. Car exhaust. The exact mechanism that scientists would later determine had killed his wife. Whether he intended it as a self-destruction fantasy or had already turned the idea outward toward her, the journals revealed a man who had been living in a world of profound rage, religious obsession, and murderous ideation. A man who described his wife as a monster. A man who slept on the first floor with a window open and a fan running. A man who waited, investigators concluded, while his wife died upstairs, and then called 911. At trial, the prosecutor connected every dot. The separate bedrooms, the exhaust tracers, the journals, the carboxyhemoglobin gap, the rigor mortis. After less than 9 hours of deliberation, the jury came back. Guilty. Guilty of aggravated murder. Judge Richard Warren looked at Mark Wangler and told him he had violated 2 of the most sacred oaths a man could take, the 10 Commandments and the Hippocratic Oath. And then he sentenced him to life in prison. Dr. Mark Wangler is currently housed at the Marion Correctional Institution in Ohio. His first parole hearing is scheduled for January 2036. He won't be eligible for release until March of that year, nearly 30 years after the night he made that call. He never stopped fighting. He filed appeals, he challenged the journal seizure, and the court agreed it exceeded the warrant scope, but they called it harmless. The science, the blood levels, the medical evidence, it was enough. He filed a federal habeas corpus petition, arguing ineffective counsel and constitutional violations. It was dismissed. His son Aaron still believes his father is innocent. His second wife, Esther, whom he married just 14 months after Kathy's death, has also maintained his innocence, even pursuing legal action against individuals who she claims defrauded her while she tried to raise money for his defense. Mark remarried 14 months after his first wife died. Life moved on for him.